I built a decentralized version of Twitter, like Mastodon, like Bluesky, inside Twitter in 2008. So if you can invest in a company, that company becomes big with 300 million users, that's a great outcome. If you can create a new industry with lots of companies that you can invest in, that's a much better outcome. The point of these protocols, of these so-called decentralized protocols, is not to separate us. They're actually collaborative technologies. They're cooperative protocols.
Hi, Rabble.
Hey, Alice.
How's it going?
It's good. We had a really interesting conversation to share with folks.
Excellent. Yes. So you were talking with Blaine Kirk, and in person this time. You were both in San Francisco for Food Camp. And Blaine is one of the architects of the modern social web. You worked together at Twitter in the early days. I know you'll be discussing that with Blaine. Blaine created Oauth and pioneered other technologies that underpin the kind of infrastructure of the decentralized internet. So before we jump in and hear more about that conversation, let's introduce ourselves.
Yeah, I'm Rabble. I was the sort of founding engineer at the company that made Twitter, and I've launched a new startup, Divine, which brings back the essence of Vine. And I started this podcast to understand, how did we get here in the world of social media?
And I'm Alice. Rabble and I have worked together now for a couple of years. I'm a longtime communicator and marketer in Silicon Valley, trying to help make these things accessible to everybody. So tell me a little bit about Blaine, and you've known each other for a really long time. What has Blaine's contribution been to the world of social media as we know it?
Blaine is someone who has been incredibly influential in designing the technology that becomes social media. He created the @reply on Twitter. He made its APIs, and he built this thing called Oauth, which is, people don't know about it, but it's like, how do you log in with Twitter, log in with Google, log in with Facebook? He built all that technology. And so much of what we use every day was built by Blaine. And I really wanted to get him on the podcast so that he could tell his story about how he built these things and the trade-offs that were in them. And so we talk about that, sort of where the early days of Twitter comes from. And then we talk about the very complicated decisions that were made in the design of these social media ecosystems, the design of what goes viral, what is abuse, how do you build a system that is open to harassment or not, and the power dynamics that went into these decisions. And so the podcast ends with us talking about the work that Blaine is doing now, building healthier social media, building social media that's based on research on how it can be more pro-social. And so the arc of this conversation, it's a longer conversation, but it goes into, how was Twitter created? What were the power dynamics and the decisions that shaped what it became? And then how can we build something new, this new product he's building called Roundabout, which doesn't replicate these kind of problems?
Yeah, I think it's really interesting because there's kind of two camps when you hear about the history of social media. There's people like Kara Swisher, who's obviously a longtime commentator on the industry and is convinced that from the very beginning, the intentions were bad and were designed to, basically either create harm or only in the self-interest of those that were building the apps. And then there's people like you and Blaine who are like, well, no, actually, we were trying to do something good in the beginning, but other forces took over beyond our control. Like, how do you kind of think about that?
So I think that there were people who were entirely predatory and just wanted to make money on it. But I don't think those were the people there in the very beginning, because there was no money to be made in social media when it was created. Yeah. We tried to convince people to do podcasting and no one was interested. And so what Blaine and I talk about in this podcast is, when did it start to shift, and how is it that dynamics of power and money and trade-offs that we make when we're designing these things, how did that shape what we have today and what won out?
Yeah, and obviously that's a very real dilemma that we face today in building Divine, right? Like, we need to make money to cover our costs, and we want to make sure we're not repeating any of that predatory behavior that people have become so dissatisfied with, and it's not for the good of social media in itself. So let's take a listen to your conversation.
There's someone who I have wanted to have on this podcast, who's a very old friend, Blaine Cook. And I am so glad that we are actually able to sit down in person and talk. Welcome, Blaine.
Amazing. Thank you. Great to be here.
I wonder if you could talk about the, Twitter now is this sort of famous thing where they won an award at South by Southwest and it became this moment. And I remember you doing a sort of a bunch of frantic work for that. So I wonder if you could talk about what that experience is, because that's the first time that any kind of larger world thought Twitter was interesting.
Yeah. I think we definitely struck a chord, obviously. I think the shift to something that was, I think where Twitter sits in the sort of social media ecosystem is it's this global conversation. And we can talk later about whether or not that's a good thing to exist almost. But
in 2007 and 2008, it seemed like kind of an amazing opportunity.
Yeah.
By 2016, we could see some problems with it.
Yeah. We were a very, very small organization trying to build something that was, I don't think anybody really understood the scope of what we were building at that point. So yeah, during that South by, I was in the office in San Francisco, just like keeping things alive. It was a very, very shoestring operation.
And they had rented screens and built a custom app to put screens in the hallway to try and have people see the tweets because people were doing it. And in many ways, it was an adaptation during South by of a model that existed in the past. Previously, there had been sort of an IRC, sort of group chat that people might have been engaging with on their laptops during conference sessions. So people could have sort of a back channel. And that back channel got easier to use if it was on your phone. And so...
Yeah, especially at an event like South by Southwest where if you've ever been to South by, you know that it's this like... You're moving around between different venues. The venue, like the conference venue itself, is this gigantic building, and so it's not the kind of thing where you can hang out on your computer. And I think by that point the iPhone had landed, and so people sort of had this.
But no apps could be installed. Like
right.
It was an
iPhone
iPhone without apps.
Yeah, and so people could interact, and it became like sort of a walkie-talkie kind of system for people at the conference, and it became this like essential utility that everybody was using.
And it started to get buzz, and it started to get excitement. And I remember that was the first moment when you started to get a lot of stress around just like how to keep the servers up and like how to meet the demand of all these people who wanted to join it. And people started using it in different ways.
Yeah. And I think we were really excited about all of that use. But the particular way that the Twitter works and the way that we'd built it, I think it tapped into a scale that not many other systems had kind of encountered. I was at Atmosphere Conference a couple of years ago and was chatting to some of the Bluesky folks and had this realization that they were playing with some Raspberry Pis and getting, there's this relay feed of all of the posts on Bluesky. And I had a realization that the systems that we were running Twitter on at that time were the equivalent of a Raspberry Pi in 2026 was our primary database server.
Yeah.
And nowadays people talk about, scaling Bluesky or Mastodon or whatever as like a, not an insurmountable technical challenge, but not a trivial technical challenge. So it was kind of, in many ways, it was like ahead of its time in terms of the scale of the technical challenge that we were trying to take on. You still see this sort of manifested in Facebook in the way that we experience Facebook. They didn't have a chronological feed.
When Facebook and other Facebook properties like Instagram to this day and Threads now do not have a live real-time feed you can follow. And so that's part of Threads, which is, Meta's Twitter-type competitor that they've launched in the last couple of years. Part of the reason it doesn't work for sports, it doesn't work for politics, it doesn't work for that real-time conversation is because they're based on a set of meta database and other technologies that says, we're not going to show you everything in real time. We're not going to try and do this kind of thing like that where you tweet and everybody sees it immediately. Instead, they're going to be like, they're going to use their algorithms to sort of mediate it.
Yeah.
You took on the really hard problems of it, and the servers often crashed. There was the famous fail whale that got put up whenever the servers crashed.
Yeah, it's a much harder problem to show this sort of consistent live view of the world, and so I think that's sort of intrinsic to what people think of as Twitter. Is this like it is what's happening, versus Facebook, where it's sort of like this is what's being shown to me, and it's sort of a selection of kind of content that might be of interest to you. That agency and that control and that visibility was really core to what was happening, and I think we are. Certainly my vision for that was around this kind of API idea where, we didn't want it to just be what we were presenting to you.
Yeah.
We wanted it to be this sort of, and we worked on this stuff like a protocol to have a feed of just data that you can share with people. So a social data feed essentially. Was one of the core ideas there. So we were building infrastructure for that. And
I think it's important to now point out that at this point, a couple years in, a community of developers had come to like Twitter, come to use Twitter, and because it was sort of more protocol-like. It wasn't a protocol, but it was very protocol-like. And so they didn't need to ask Twitter's permission to build new apps. And so you got a whole slew of different apps. And so it meant that users might be using Twitter with never seeing anything from the Twitter company. Yeah.
And we had all sorts of, interesting use cases. So like at replies was one that we saw people starting to, mention people on the feed. And I think, for me, the design of at replies, because I think often the story is sort of told that it came from the users. And I think the real story is more complicated than that because I think we took that behavior and we were like, oh, this is a thing that people want to do, but just naively linking those mentions wasn't enough. So you would have so when we were still very small then, so I designed kind of the implementation, I built and designed the implementation for at replies, and the way that we made it work, people would often mention people, and there would be this two-way sort of conversation, but you wouldn't necessarily follow both of them, and so a frequent experience would be you'd see this person who's having a conversation.
But you'd only see half the conversation.
But you'd only see half the conversation. And so you're like, what is this? And it's filling up my feed and I'm getting text messages. This isn't a great experience. And so when we designed at replies, we actually took that out and we said, you're only going to see messages that are sent to people that you also follow. So you can see both sides of the conversation.
And that's the thing people don't realize is that Twitter had all these really subtle design decisions that you created that had the effect of scoping conversation. So they didn't do the two-way friend thing, although there was a brief moment at the beginning where following was like a two-way friendship. But it was one way. So I could follow you and you didn't have to follow me. I could mention you and then you would see my stuff even though I didn't follow you, which we'll get into because caused a lot of problems. And then if you @reply someone at the beginning, it would only show those things to the subset of people who followed both people. And so it created these really lightweight group forming things that users didn't even have to know they were doing.
Some of our early users really disliked some of the decisions that we were making. And then, on the people being able to mention you
and have it show up in a notification.
And have it show up was a thing that I really struggled with, and we had an early conversation internally where, I was looking at implementing that, and we didn't have a big staff, and I was like, this is an obvious vector for spam and abuse.
To me, this is the moment I remember when you were having this discussion, the first moment that there was a serious discussion about abuse and antisocial behavior on Twitter.
Yeah.
And, that's kind of funny now because you're like, oh my God, Twitter became this sort of, in some ways, a cesspool of trolling and anger and flame wars and everything else. But there was a moment in early design decisions where you had to decide what happened and whether or not you could mention someone who you didn't follow or they didn't follow you, and what would happen to their experience.
Yeah.
The thing that I think is really important is people think that you didn't have a discussion about what is this going to do to people?
Yeah.
Or that you specifically didn't object to what ends up being a vehicle for a lot of antisocial behavior.
Yeah. Yeah. So that conversation was, at the time, I knew that it would feel this way in retrospect, I suppose, because the conversation was basically like, we don't have the engineering or organizational capacity to deal with the sort of abuse that's going to result from this feature. So my sort of conservative instinct was to say, you're only going to see mentions from people that you follow.
Yep.
And that would have given control to the users about, who they're seeing messages from and would have kind of
eventually, 10 or 15 years later, that functionality was added.
Yeah. Yeah. But it would have stemmed that sort of behavior where you can sort of out-reply to anybody. But the argument from the product team was, but it'll be way less viral. And they were right.
Mm-hmm.
Twitter probably wouldn't have succeeded.
And it's worth mentioning that Twitter wasn't the only micro blogging service like Twitter. There was Pounce and there was Jaiku and there were other experiments in the space. And if you're like, why were those decisions made? Or how did we get here? Companies and the product teams that chose the more viral thing, they chose the more engaging thing, are the ones that grew and survived.
Yeah. I was a 25-year-old programmer. And so I said, I can't take responsibility for this. I can't build the tools to deal with this, and kind of said to the product team, I'll build this, but you have to take personal responsibility for this. I won't name names, but they're very wealthy now. And I think they didn't take responsibility for it. I think the organization didn't take responsibility for those things.
They hired someone to run trust and safety, but didn't let them engage actively in the design decisions.
Yeah.
Instead, were clean up the messes from this design.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly.
There were many social media apps that were not Twitter and that were not Facebook.
Yeah.
And almost always the ones we have now were the ones that chose the decision to make the more engaging, the more viral, the more we complain about all these different technologies that cause addictive behavior or cause antisocial behavior, or in particular the mentions thing ends up becoming a huge vector for harassment, especially of activists and of women. The people who didn't choose to implement it that way are apps we don't remember.
Right. Yeah.
And so the incentive structure around that is really hard. Hey, this is just a quick interruption to ask you to follow revolution.social on your podcast app or YouTube. And if you're already following us, please rate and review it. Tell a friend about the show. Thank you very much.
And to be fair, people chose to use the more viral ones because they were more viral.
Yeah.
Right?
Because they could build a bigger audience, because it felt like you were dropping into a bigger zeitgeist. And
I think it's interesting because we actually got away with it for far longer than I thought we would.
Yeah.
I thought that the spam and the abuse would be immediate. When we launched at replies with the ability to mention people. I think it was a year and a half before there was any noticeable abuse of that feature, which was remarkable to me because it felt like such an obvious vector. And the fact that it didn't happen, I don't know, maybe speaks well of humanity, but it meant that it existed long enough that maybe it was hard to change when that stuff started to emerge, because there were sort of like more established patterns of usage of that feature. So there's no easy answer, I think, but I do, I certainly feel like there's this narrative that those of us who were there in the early web didn't know what was going to happen with a lot of the tools that we were building. And to some extent that's true, and to some extent it's really not true. I think we knew quite well what a lot of the impact and whatnot was going to be. Maybe not the scale.
I think the scale shocked me. Like, I mean, I did not like. I expected it to be popular amongst the world of people who had blogs, amongst the world of people who might show up to South by Southwest, amongst the people who are really excited about internet technologies and everything else. Yeah. But I at least thought it was too esoteric and too nerdy and like too sort of, there were too many codes you had to do and things like that in order for it to have a mass audience of non-technical people. There was a moment when Twitter was most a protocol.
Yeah.
Most like podcasting, most like email, most like the web. And there was this one sort of to me glorious moment where Twitter started walking down a very different path for what it could be.
Yeah.
And that was the moment in which you sat down and started working with technologists from other companies that had Twitter-like apps and Jaiku and what I think became Google Buzz and another one called Pounce. And you said, what if you could post and follow between these like you can email from Gmail to Hotmail?
Yeah, absolutely. And so that's, as Twitter was becoming more popular, I was looking at it from a couple of different lenses. One, this question of moderation and sort of safety. I'm like, we can't make these decisions for the whole world. That's not possible.
The funny thing is, before there's a Donald Trump on there, before everything else, before politicians and leaders and celebrities on there, you were like, there's a problem when we, the people who made this platform, or whoever happens to be CEO at the moment, gets to decide who says what.
Yeah, exactly. And I think from our activist background, like we understand. I come from a world where I understand what decision making looks like.
Yeah.
And sort of negotiating decisions amongst
what does
people.
Consent look like? What does
Exactly.
democracy look like? What does consensus look like? How should people get to participate in the institutions and technologies of life to the extent at which it affects them?
That's right. Yeah. So that was apparent. And then the other side of the coin was it was just growing so fast that I was looking at it and I'm like, how do we manage this infrastructure as a single small organization? So as a technologist, I was like, well, the internet is one of these systems, right? No one organization could run the internet. I built a decentralized version of Twitter, like Mastodon, like Bluesky, inside Twitter in 2008. I had a conversation with our lead investor at the time, but I knew that if I wanted to pursue this protocol path, I was going to need his sign off.
Yeah.
Because there was no way that if the investors were going to say don't do this, I was not going to win that battle. And I was actually really surprised by his answer. He was really excited about it. As an investor, if you can invest in a company that company becomes big with 300 million users, that's a great outcome.
Yeah.
If you can create a new industry with lots of companies that you can invest in, that's a much better outcome from an investment perspective. And that's what he said. He was like, yeah, maybe we'll be a big fish in a small pond. What if we create a whole ecosystem? So I took that as sort of permission to try, and spent some time working on this, and basically took our initial API and implemented it on top of a protocol called XMPP, but just an open protocol, and built a microblogging version of that, and we were able to integrate Jaiku and Twitter, and I was able to follow people on Jaiku without having a Jaiku account, and they were able to follow people on Twitter without having a Twitter account.
And you could reply to each other.
Yeah, we could reply, we could send messages back and forth, and the systems worked basically the way that you see Mastodon or Bluesky work today, where you can sort of choose which platform hosts your data and defines the product experience. Without coordination. And that was really exciting.
That's kind of similar sort of how podcasting works, where you can choose who you publish your podcast with. You can choose, like, eventually there became ads in podcasts, who provides the ads, and you can listen to the podcast and lots of things, or you can, you can email from Gmail to Hotmail.
Yeah, exactly.
Or set up your own.
Exactly. Yeah. When I built Oauth for it was originally for Twitter, but I didn't want to just create a thing that worked only for Twitter. I wanted something that would work for lots of companies, for anybody to sort of pick up that same pattern, and be able to trust it as a authentication protocol, so you knew who was using the system and that the users using the system could be secure. But it was really, built for this kind of decentralization, where the first thing that we needed to solve was this like stable identity problem. Like if you make everything decentralized, you take that bot problem that we were talking about earlier, and you just make it 1,000 times worse, because now,
like, who is someone?
Yeah.
So we have this thing where we now have these sort of stable identities, and they're owned by accounts, and they're owned by companies and servers and everything else. And it's sort of important to remember that sort of at this moment, we were trying to build, how do these apps work? And so you had built this federation between Jaiku and Twitter where you could follow people back and forth. But most users weren't logging into Jaiku or Twitter. Most users were logging into TweetDeck or Twitterific or TweetDroid, these other apps.
Yeah.
And at the time you put your email and password in, which means you had to trust this app developer entirely, because they could do everything on your behalf. They could steal your account. And that felt bad.
Yeah.
Like, this felt like a bad security thing. And so you develop this technology that lets you log in with stuff. Log in with Twitter originally. That was the idea.
Yeah.
And then that would let the users be able to use these apps without having to trust that they aren't going to do something nefarious. And so the original idea behind this was really powerful. It's like, how do we make it so that we can disconnect the apps you're using from the servers you're using from your identity? And the goal was to add a later on technology that meant that users owned and controlled their names.
Exactly. Yeah. And it's been, Oauth has been phenomenally successful, but it's also sort of resulted in this lock-in, essentially, where, now it's kind of Google, Microsoft, strangely Yahoo, and Apple kind of own all of our identities.
Yeah.
After I left Twitter, I continued to work on open standards and open protocols, and worked on, some of the precursors to ActivityPub and the things that power Mastodon, and
a huge amount of fundamental technologies we use in the web today.
Yeah, and it just felt so important. That was obviously the thing that I felt like I needed to work on at that point, and I poured a huge amount of energy into those things. And even as, the Twitter developers were getting locked out and everything, I just kept having these conversations with people where I would say, hey, so this this Facebook monopoly thing is a real problem. It's a problem for society. It's a problem for business. It's a problem for sort of everything that we're trying to do with the internet.
This is many years before any public scandals around it.
Yeah.
This was a moment in which people were like, Facebook is amazing. Twitter is amazing. They're only good. Like, they're saying good things. They're nice and everything else. And you, having built Twitter, were going around saying that we need to be really worried about this concentration of power.
Yeah, exactly. And what I kept hearing back was, no, Facebook apps are great. People were excited about the sort of possibility of what they could build.
Activists were on there, news publications were on there, community organizations in every neighborhood were on there, and they're like, they're amazing, and now we can get everything else, and it's fast and it's easy, and eventually,
people, the
Internet.org goes and makes free Facebook apps to phone company, anybody who has a mobile phone in the developing world, and
the place that we met, working on indie media sort of stuff, where the rallying cry was "Be the media," that happened.
Yeah,
but it was on Facebook, and people didn't realize what they were giving up, or what the other possibilities were, and so they were excited about having this voice and having this sort of creative outlet, but didn't see the constraints. And I think I had a very unique perspective into what both what the constraints and the possibilities were. It's definitely hard to see, in so many ways, the success, but also this failure of the move, like a movement to give people more agency over their voices and their communities, but also the profound loss. And I think we see the effects of that when we talk about the role of tech in society. I think everybody understands sort of what a massive impact that's had, and what a profound loss that's been for communities and for so many different industries. But I think the key piece is that it didn't really need to be that way. So we for around that time, I kind of gave up because I think it was just too much to push against, and the trying to make the argument, especially from the perspective of I'm a technologist. I see the possibility, but it's hard to communicate. And my background is I did sociology in university, not computer science. But I'm not that sort of person who's going to be an advocate and speaking truth to power in that really legible way. But I couldn't sort of bear to watch, so kind of gave up working on a lot of these protocols for a long time. But more recently, I think there have been lots of people who have put just immense amounts of effort into working on these pieces, who were maybe less burnt out than I was at that point. Yeah. And as a result, over time we've seen the emergence of things like Mastodon, which was just immense at demonstrating to people, there is another way possible, and we can use some of these technologies in more ways that preserve agency and
we can get the ability to communicate. We can make apps that work well. We can make apps that deliver. We can design these things, but we can also design them in ways that you run the servers yourself, or it's decentralized. You control apps, and there was a lot of new technology development that had to happen.
Totally.
The technology we had in 2006 wouldn't work for the kind of social media protocols and decentralized stuff we have today. But we could have built it. We could have changed different priorities.
I think if the it's it's a thing that I've definitely thought about.
Yeah.
I think if Twitter had shipped the decentralized version,
Yeah.
it wouldn't have been perfect. But I think there are outcomes that would have been very, very different in how we think about technology today. The like things like, so the hashtag is maybe a good example of this, where the extent to which technology and sort of culture are linked is pretty profound. We all understand this. But at the time when Chris Messina came up with the idea for hashtags, it was really nerdy. It was like, let's put, this hash symbol in front of some text to, and he was kind of talking about it so that you can search for things, and you can have like
find all the posts about the bar camp meetup thing we were going to do, the little conference.
Exactly. And so I was like, hey, this is interesting, but actually you can just search for those words. And also our user base is really nerdy. We want to appeal to a broader audience.
Yeah.
This does not make our platform less nerdy. Please stop doing this. We don't want this to be a thing. Hashtag fetch, right? Like, and so I sort
Little
of,
did we know, we now see hashtags, and have for a long time now, over billboards and over things, and people use them for social movements, and I didn't think that would ever take off.
Totally. And I said to Chris, like, if you don't stop doing it, I'm going to filter every tweet that has a hashtag
and make them just disappear.
And just make them disappear. And so I came really close. I'm not a jerk, so I didn't actually do it, but I was like
this close to killing hashtags.
Hashtags would have never happened.
Aborted them.
But the thing that I missed at the time was the power of this sort of like this collective idea around understanding how technology sort of exists in our world.
Yeah.
And I don't think it's a thing that people like necessarily reflect upon, but it is this sort of like, there are cultural touch points in how we interact with technology. And so I think as, all of these open source developers, like the Mastodon folks, like the ActivityPub folks, like, so many of the like a lot of the crypto work has turned into really interesting stuff. As people were doing that, society was simultaneously sort of coming to understand the wider implications of these platforms and of the control structures and everything of these platforms. And so, Cambridge Analytica was an important point, but then also just the total dominance of technology in our economic landscape now has people sort of saying, oh, hey, this is maybe a problem, and what does this mean for our communities? What does this mean for for our ability to communicate and relate to each other, our families? Obviously during sort of COVID and afterwards, the sort of social, sort of more reactionary social movements that we've seen.
That's a fascinating thing. So we weren't unaware that right-wing movements could operate in decentralized ways.
Yeah.
Like, I remember that we had conversations about groups like Anti-Racist Action and others who were fighting neo-Nazis and skinheads. And we were aware that those groups often didn't function with a centralized set of control and everything else. They operated in this sort of decentralized racist way. And so we knew that they could come together in crowds. Yeah. And we knew that they could organize. But there was also sort of this hopeful thing, whereas that maybe if we just remove the power of CNN, we remove the dominance of the New York Times and everything else, that we on the left broadly would be able to no longer be locked out and have a voice. And we would just sort of bowl over them. And the concern was, how do we organize against systems of power and not so much are we opening up the door for what becomes Gamergate, what becomes eventually Donald Trump using this to leverage from being a reality TV star to president?
Yeah. And I hope the lesson is not, that only the right can use decentralized technologies and everything. But that, really it was people all along, and people are messy and complicated. And actually it's the coordination work that we do that's really important. And one of the things that I've been reflecting on recently is this idea that actually the term decentralized technologies is really the wrong thing. And I think we should move away from using the term, because we've used this term decentralized social networking refers to the sort of the technical architecture of what's happening. So you've got this one centralized system that's sort of designed and built and run by a single organization. You decentralize it by separating it and allow different organizations to run their own infrastructures independently.
Yeah.
But actually the point of these protocols, of these so-called decentralized protocols, is not to separate us. It's to allow us to collaborate and cooperate without having sort of one organization dictate how everything works. So they're actually collaborative technologies. They're cooperative protocols. And I think we need to sort of reframe that. And it's less about this sort of atomization and more this sort of like cooperative approach to how we think about sociality on the internet, which is obviously just sociality. But we don't think about these sorts of topologies when we're just talking about people interacting in the real world. But the architectural foundational concerns are incredibly important, even if they're invisible when we're interacting online, because they dictate how everything works.
Yeah, there's sort of these invisible set of rules or laws that define what is possible. Yeah. And if you look throughout history, like many times the changes in technologies have had massive effects. Like the Protestant Reformation isn't because Martin Luther somehow had unique ideas that distant theologians hadn't had 50, 100, 200 years earlier. Like, yes, they were very specific in the time, but he was able to use the movable type press, the Gutenberg press, to change the power dynamics around communication. And but it wasn't like the Catholic Church didn't use those same tools. Like the original goal of Gutenberg was to print Bibles, and more Bibles have been printed than any other book, while it still unseated the power of the Catholic Church. And so, like, we're seeing this today with all of these other technologies, which is like, okay, if you build a system by which a single person has control, then you get to be upset about whether or not Jack Dorsey bans Donald Trump's account or not, whether or not Elon Musk bans it. And all of a sudden, the politics of Elon Musk and Mark Zuckerberg and Jack Dorsey and Sundar Pichai and Tim Cook and a half dozen other guys becomes really, really important because they control the means of communication. And I remember we had this, phrase, I had a sticker on my laptop, seize the means of communication. Yeah. And we were working on democratizing the means of communication. And if we had, it's a funny thing because we did it. We democratized the means of communication. Like there is a world with radically different conceptions of gatekeepers, and we have had innumerable numbers of social movements get together and find each other and organize and change the world. And, the biggest example is the way in which you have trans people today who can find each other, who can see each other, who be like people who were very deeply uncomfortable with their own gender in the way society treated them, but they thought they were alone.
Yeah.
Or they thought they couldn't find safety and community. And so the moment we gave them the tools, they did that and they organized and we see quite rapid transformational change.
Yeah.
But it did also open up the space for the demagogue.
Yeah. I think the structure, when we talk about who's got the decision-making power, I think we're still quite a ways off. We're getting closer, but we're quite a ways off from being able to really, at a societal level, at a political level, challenge some of those notions. So I think when you bring up the trans community is obviously really concerned about age verification for a whole host of reasons. But I think implicit in the impulse to regulate platforms based on age is this idea that they're unchangeable. So I often describe this as like, if we had libraries and 20 years ago people were like, you know what, libraries would be more financially sustainable if we let people put sort of one-armed bandit like gambling machines into libraries.
Yeah.
And then, we should have a bar in the library. That would be great. And let's just make it a strip club too.
What we're doing now, you have to walk through the bar and the strip club and everything else in order to get to the children's book section. You're like, this is a nightmare. Kids can't read books
so the political decision is what we need to do is ban children from libraries. And there's this total lack of imagination that like maybe we could change. Maybe libraries could be different.
Yeah.
And I think the internet is this incredible resource, but it doesn't take one shape.
Maybe we could give librarians the right to move their books into the building next door, because right now the creators of this social media content, the curators, the managers, the moderation teams, all of they have no right to exit.
Yeah.
Because they're stuck on these platforms, and one person could go and they could take their 5 books away, but they can't move the section or the whole library. And so we're like, rather than be like, you librarians get to control this thing and you do not have to have the strip club and the casino in your library, we say that let's make a universal database of every single person who comes in, track all of their activity, it will leak online, and then try and stop kids from using the library.
Exactly. And obviously that would be horrendous, right? We want children to be able to read. And there's immense value in that. And so I think, but then when we look at the sort of the way that we think about the control, as a Canadian, I've always found this debate a little bit difficult to take seriously, because, even the normal, often the progressive take on, we can't let Twitter or Facebook or whatever decide trust and safety sorts of decisions, and like who's allowed to ban who
because
from
of
what.
First Amendment and free speech.
Yeah, exactly. And often the progressive take is like, we should let the federal government run it. And I'm like, which federal government? Because Canada has a different government with different laws, and so does Europe. And
also, if you look at like Canada, the United States, or I live in New Zealand now, these are governments that were quite literally imposed on the population that lived there at the through violence, through genocide, through disapportioning land, and aren't neutral players. Like, yes, there have been massive movements to democratize these things, to build inclusion, to account for class harms, and they are better than absolute monarchies in the past.
Totally.
But they are not neutral players. They reflect the power dynamics and the powerful interests in these societies.
Yeah. And so in Canada, it's really interesting because we simultaneously have this active move towards sort of devolution and land acknowledgement and sort of like, acknowledging the First Nations and whatnot in that really compose Canada. And at the same time, we're unable to see that, like these tech monarchies essentially might be that we could challenge that idea and that we could have autonomy over these spaces. It's strange, I think, this moment that we're at, because in a physical geography, it's really hard to negotiate these things. There's all sorts of expensive physical constraints that make this sort of negotiation difficult. In digital spaces, there aren't. They're just imaginary. We created these spaces not that long ago, and they're essentially, they're not free.
Because you can copy software, and because servers are these sort of universal machines and everything else, that like we have sort of not infinite, but broad flexibility on how we run these and create these.
Exactly. But they kind of miss this idea that servers are just the thing that we run this software on. And it's actually the software that needs to change if we're going to be able to have that agency. You can't just build a European data center and then let Facebook run in it.
Yeah,
that doesn't actually give us
the American-run Facebook corporation keeping your data in Europe doesn't actually protect your data.
Right.
And you need different software and different rules.
Right.
Which gets us to the organization that you are now working with. The thing that brought you back.
Yeah.
From the despair of this is not solvable. This is organization New Public.
Yeah.
Which is an organization that both of us have known for a bunch of years. And it's an organization that was started initially to critique the idea of filter bubbles, the idea of what Facebook and these other platforms are doing. And they started off just critiquing the big platforms. And then they decided that they were going to find something better. And it turns out in parts of the world that aren't here in the San Francisco Bay Area, that aren't funded by venture capital, that aren't attempting to blow up and take over the world, that there are better ways of doing this. And this should not surprise anyone that Meta, Facebook, TikTok, Twitter, Snapchat are the only ways of doing it. And so there is this app that exists, oddly enough, in Vermont called Front Porch Forum. And this group, New Public, that started asking, why is it that 80% of Vermont households use this thing? And how is it that it is so similar to Nextdoor.com, which is famously toxic? Now, the Nextdoor founders were very hopeful. Like they were utopian in their community goals. But to get to the world, they raised venture capital that set up a set of incentives that made them choices. So now that it is all over the place. And the Front Porch Forum folks made very different decisions.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think, that those decisions that Nextdoor and that Facebook made have had really profound implications for our communities.
We see the big public of Twitter, the giant, like we see Trump's tweets, we see the tweet wars and the flame wars and like dominating the news. But the community stuff isn't on Twitter. The community stuff is on these Facebook groups and these Nextdoor forums.
Yeah. And Twitter's peak was, 300 million users, something like that. Facebook is much bigger. Every community in America, in Europe, has
all over the world
has a Facebook group or a Nextdoor or some forum where they convene, and especially since sort of the collapse of local journalism, which I think is more profound than we even realize. Those spaces have kind of replaced that function. But Corey gifted us this word institutification. came for these spaces. And so the platforms realized that, they make money on engagement based on time that people spend looking at the screens. And they realized that, showing people fights in their communities got eyeballs. People love a fight. And so they would show
and a controversy and fear.
Yeah.
If it bleeds, it leads.
Exactly. And so they took, that sort of cable news imperative and they put it into our communities. And because they weren't present in our communities, because there weren't people from our communities in these spaces, and it was all just algorithmic, they were looking at like, oh, we put some rage bait into the community and the engagement went up and we made more ad revenue.
Got people upset, and they sat there and they spent all night like arguing with each other.
Exactly. And so the thing that we've been left with is this idea that our communities hate each other.
That things are getting more dangerous and that crime levels are going up. None of these are reflected in actual statistics.
Exactly.
But perceptions of these things are profound.
Yeah. And there's a huge trust crisis, especially in America. But then when we look at sort of like, do you trust your neighbors? The reality is people do trust their neighbors. And actually communities are often very healthy. But the communities that we see reflected in, our media of today are of these unhealthy communities. It turns out that if you focus on healthy communities, having healthy communities, you can have those online. And
they're things people want to use.
And they're things that people want to use. People are desperate for this connection. And it's actually not that complicated. You just have to not intentionally break people's interactions. Facebook is actively harming people.
What did Front Porch do that was different?
So they just, they have local connection. They're really careful about the sort of content that they put into the space.
It's important to remember that Facebook groups can grow to be huge, but Facebook makes no active intervention because they're at scale. They make no active intervention who the moderators are.
Yeah.
So whoever creates a Facebook group, they get to decide who they invite in as moderators. And so it's almost like a sort of hereditary control system.
Totally.
And so there are Facebook groups that are moderated really well, and there are Facebook groups that are moderated really poorly. But there's no democratic control, or there's no platform saying, are you doing this in the interest of community?
Yeah.
Are you really even in this town?
Yeah. Most local Facebook groups are created by people who care about their communities.
And they're using the tools they can find.
Yeah. And they want to connect their community. They see a need. And so they create these communities, and New Public did research on this and found that the tools just weren't there to support the people. And so often what happens is, Facebook moderators get really burnt out because they're essentially forced into this position of conflict resolution with no tools to do conflict resolution.
The reason I bring this up, the reason I bring up New Public and the reason I bring up the work you're doing here is because New Public set out to find somewhere on the internet where social media is better, and understand why it's better. And they found a whole bunch of things that Front Porch Forum does that are all relatively small design decisions in the software, and who controls the software and how the software is managed and what the flow of the messages are. And they went to the Front Porch Forum people and they said, why don't you expand beyond Vermont? And the Front Porch Forum people said, as far as I know, no, we're actually fine. Like we never intend, we don't want to take over the world, and we don't know what Floridians want. We don't know the culture of Florida, much less Ecuador or, South Africa. We don't know those things, and we don't want to go raise venture capital that will then push us into algorithms and everything else. We have a sustainable small business that serves our own community, and we've done it. And so New Public came to you and said, can we build something that takes those learnings, but not just that, but combines the learnings of Front Porch Forum of what makes a healthy online community with the work that you had done in saying that social media and this technology should be controlled by the users, should work more like email, like podcasting, like the web itself, and less like the systemic systems that ended up giving us TikTok and Instagram and Twitter.
Yeah, so I think Front Porch Forum quite rightly chose not to expand, because by expanding they would have destroyed the thing that they've created. But New Public felt really strongly.
But other communities should have this amazing thing too.
Exactly, and it turns out that it's actually really difficult to build these things, and so New Public sort of did a bunch of research and figured out what were the things that were likely to make communities healthy, and had compiled all of this research and done a bunch of planning, and I joined this amazing team that had sort of pulled all of this together and had a really clear thesis on how to build these things. We've built the thing called Roundabout. We've launched in 5 pilot communities. And one of the core concepts in what we're doing is that the communities really need stewards. They need people who are invested in and empowered to sort of not just run the site, but like actually create the site and uplift their community. And we've worked really closely with them to understand what that role is, what the tools are that they need, and how this project could be successful at scale without taking away the agency of the stewards and their relationship to their community. So that's really key in all of this is that local piece. And I think we feel very strongly, I certainly feel very strongly that this agency piece is so important, because I hope that New Public and Roundabout will always be healthy stewards of these spaces, but we know from example that we ourselves were some of the, and everyone we were working with were incredibly well-meaning, idealistic people who wanted to build healthy, happy spaces for people to connect, and built things that had unintended consequences, or where you leave and other new people take control. And so some of the interesting things that you have built into Roundabout, because you've built it on some of the same technology app protocol that Bluesky uses, is the right to host it yourself, the right to exit, the ability to very easily move, so a community together can move, as opposed to the way if you want to leave Instagram, you leave and then everybody's like, oh, I guess, Bob stopped posting. Yeah. You have no way of everybody moving off together, but the way you've designed Roundabout is different. Yeah. Yeah. And I think...
And that's accountability. That's a power. That's a check on power.
Exactly. Yeah. And I think that's absolutely key. We're acting as stewards ourselves as New Public to try and create the possibility of having these spaces. But, obviously it's important that these spaces are sort of economically feasible by themselves. But our ultimate goal really is to try and help communities engage and become healthier and have people feel better about their communities, because most often their communities are great, and I think what we're seeing. So there's a I guess a few different ways that we're already seeing this manifest. One is this protocol piece, especially in this era of agentic coding and everything. There are a lot of people who are like, oh, I've got this tool, I can go and build a new platform. And even when I joined New Public, I sort of joke that I've had a lot of conversations with people who are interested in building community platforms, and my answer was always, "That's a great idea. It's really important. You should definitely not do it because it will definitely fail, and it's way harder than you think." And one of the big challenges in that is just there's sort of the initial idea, but then there's the infrastructure that I liken it to municipal infrastructure, like the water systems and the electrical systems and the power grid and all of these sorts of things. Like there's a lot that you have to do that you don't imagine when you're looking at turning on a tap and getting water flowing to water your plants. To have a plant in your home, you don't need to invent a municipal water system. And so now we're looking at these protocols and we're saying, okay, so if people can, have new apps, like they can have new plants, there's still all of this infrastructure. There's still all of this connective tissue that we need to make sociality really work. And I think these protocols are that sort of infrastructure level piece. And I think this is really important. You and I were in New York a few years ago for a Black Twitter summit where
this was right after Elon had bought. This was a summit organized by the Craig Newmark School of Journalism, and it was right after Elon had bought Twitter, and there was a community of academics and creators and big users of Black Twitter, and they wanted to make sense of it, and we were sort of some of the like token technologists who were not in the room to tell them what to do, but to answer some questions about how did we get here.
Yeah. And I sort of...
We listened a lot.
Yeah. And I sort of went to that gathering thinking, there's these emancipatory technologies, please don't, like I hope we don't end up on another platform where this is inevitably going to happen again. And, Black Twitter is this incredibly inspiring community that had emerged on Twitter, but they didn't have agency, they didn't have control, and
they carved out space.
Yeah, exactly. And one of the things that I heard listening to those conversations that we were very fortunate to be able to be a part of was that the community that assembled there didn't believe some mostly white technologists in this sort of emancipatory potential of these technologies, because at best it's like saying, okay, you can go and do the work, and you can have your own space, and either it's offloading the responsibility and it's not taking responsibility for that work, or it's like the control is an illusion, and it in no way does it actually free up people who would normally not have that control and are dependent. And the I think the feeling in that room was that like we already depend on so many systems of control anyways
that fight against their community in so many different ways.
Exactly.
And there was a reality, which is like there was several of us who were sort of white progressive technologists who'd helped build the social media ecosystem that they were using, and the world treats us differently, and we have different access to doors and capital and learning and everything else. And they were like, oh, fine, go tell us to go off and build it ourselves.
Yeah.
And there's a funny thing when I think about like the emergence of social media. Like, why did social media emerge between 2005 and 2010? Or the emergence of these protocol-based solutions, or why did blogging emerge in the late 90s? Why did the web emerge in 1994? All of these things, like the need for them wasn't just in that year or everything else. Like when a technology emerges, there has to be a whole bunch of social and economic and technological systems that come into an alignment at the same time that allow you to do it. And Twitter was made possible, you built it in 2006, but it was made possible because in 2004, Ruby on Rails, which had some scaling problems, whatever it did, but it made that first version very easy to build.
Yeah.
And it made that API very easy. And so what happened was the way in which we built technology, the way in which we built it, and then the iPhone showed up, and then we could build mobile apps and everything else. Like it wasn't that we were like, it was 2006, we decided we should have this sort of global zeitgeist communication system. Like all sorts of things had to come into line. And so what we see now in the last couple of years, especially with the rise of agentic programming, is yet again a radical transformation on how we build technology.
Yeah. You and I had conversations about this global zeitgeist app several years before Twitter emerged, because we were working on this global network of indie media and trying to sort of facilitate communication across that network. So,
and that was where we actually created the initial prototypes, this thing called TextMob, where we were learning how to send the text messages and everything else. And it didn't work very well, but we had to have those little kind of like experimental prototypes to do it.
Yeah.
And now, today, we're seeing things. And so a couple of years after that sort of infamous like Black Twitter meeting, Rudy comes along and builds this thing called Black Sky, which is the thing that says that the Black community can own and control their own algorithms, their own moderation, their own servers, all of their own stuff, and no one can pull it away from them.
Exactly. And I think, Rudy is doing absolutely incredible work. And
struggle, like even though everyone talks about it and everything else, struggles to raise money in ways that are much harder than you and I have.
Totally. But I think what he's trying to do would have been impossible if he just said, "Hey, I'm going to create a standalone Black Twitter platform."
Yeah.
And I think, Rudy's incredible because he really believes in this sort of, creating collaborative spaces. And I think we're on the verge.
Community and democratic control of Black Twitter. It's not just like him as a Black entrepreneur doing it.
Yeah. And so I think what the project now is like, we have this emergence because of 15 years of protocol work on top of all of the stuff that existed on the internet before that. There's now with AppProto and others the substrate where we can build something else.
That's the thing that is so fascinating, exciting for me is like you're able to take on rebuilding the local Facebook group, rebuilding Nextdoor, but that is community controlled, that is democratic, that is based on models do it. Like in the last year have started this thing where I'm like, what happens if I restore the Vine idea of these 6-second videos? But we answer people's questions of like, we filter it for not having AI generated content. We filter it for users control, and they don't like the way I run the servers, they can leave because again, it's built on these open protocols.
Exactly.
But users don't join it. They join it for the community. They don't you don't join Roundabout because, oh my God, it's open source or it's App Protocol or it's Nostr or like this VC funded it. You join it because that's where your friends and family are. Yeah,
exactly. And I think there's a bunch of things happening obviously right now that enable all of this. So with Roundabout, one of the things that we didn't want our stewards to spend all of their time doing was moderating and sort of conflict resolution. So, we have very clear sets of rules for the communities, just so that everybody knows what to expect in these communities. And then we use pre-moderation. So it's a really lightweight, privacy-preserving LLM model that just checks against the rules. And we really preserve human agency in that interaction. So if somebody posts something, that breaks the rules, offensive or aggressive or something like that, the model will say, okay, this rule appears to have been broken, and we tell that to the user, and we say, hey, it looks like maybe this rule was broken. and we give them a choice. We say you can either edit the post, you know what the rule is now, and if you did break the rule, you can go and edit it and not break the rule. No problem. You can still post.
And the rules are set by the community moderators, the
exactly.
stewards themselves.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah. And so so they have that choice. Or they can send it if they think that the rule wasn't broken. Like if our system got it wrong, we're not, precious about that. Sometimes machines get things wrong. We try and make it accurate, but it's not perfect. They can send it to the steward for review. And if everything's fine, they can post it right away. It gets posted to the site immediately. And there's, we still have traditional moderation tools, but having this tool means that, we can support live discussion in the community, timely discussion. If you need help, you can ask for help and get answers right away.
My dog is lost, or
Just,
reminder that 6 p.m. is the community potluck.
Yeah, exactly. Does anybody have a cup of milk that I can borrow for this thing that I'm baking? You can do that kind of thing on this platform. But then if somebody posts something that is offensive or violent or breaks the rules in some way, their expectation of what's going to happen completely changes compared to a Facebook, because they're saying to the steward, hey, I broke the rule, I understand the rule, and I want to post this anyway. And often it's like this heated kind of feeling that I need to be able to post that. And it gives everybody a chance to calm down. But it also, if the steward comes back and says no, this is the rule, you can post something else, but you can't post this. Now it's not you're censoring me conversation, because that's not a helpful, useful.
You're not allowed to yell in the library conversation.
Exactly.
It's like you've had too many drinks and we need to put you in a taxi and send you home conversation.
Exactly.
It's the way in which we have managed our own communities for
100%.
a couple 100,000 years.
Exactly.
And who it is, because they're part of your community, who is making those decisions.
Exactly. Because, I hope that we can be successful with Roundabout and really, help people have healthy communities again. But even more important than that is I don't want to be in charge of that. Despite everything, I have faith. I think people, I look around at my own community, and it is messy, but it's also really great. And I think most people look at their communities and feel the same way if they can get past the sort of the stuff that's not really of their community. New Public and Black Sky and, some of the groups working in Europe, Eurosky and whatnot to address some of these things are still quite small organizations. There's not a ton of us working on this stuff, but my hope is that there will be more. I suppose faith in our communities and in our collective ability to cooperate and to
humanity.
Move in humanity to move past this sort of. I don't think anyone's having fun right now on the left or the right. And I think if we can come up with better ways to meet, we'll do a lot better. There's a lot of challenges that we need to face, and so this feels we're not going to be able to face any of them if we don't sort this out.
I want to thank you, Blaine, for decades of work, decades of friendship, not giving up, and thinking about this and working on it and trying to figure out how we can do it better. And I want people to check out Roundabout and all of these other projects, because the whole reason I started this podcast was to understand how did we get here and where do we go. And your own career is such that arc. So I really appreciate you spending this time, and I appreciate everyone listening for this longer episode where we talk about it.
Amazing. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Cheers.
Thanks again to Blaine Cook for coming on revolution.social. Our intro and outro music is a remix of the Italian anti-fascist folk song Bella Ciao, courtesy of White Records.
Our executive producer is me, Alice Chan from Flock Marketing.
Don't forget to subscribe to the podcast and share this episode if you loved it. To sign up for email newsletter, visit revolution.social.
And for more interviews like this one, follow revolution.social on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, YouTube, Nosters, Fountain.fm, or wherever you get your podcasts.
And to paraphrase the Zapatistas, Subcomandante Marcos, we need a social media revolution to make revolution possible. We'll be back in a couple of weeks. See you then.